degrees in history and political science from Troy University, Dothan campus, and the University of South Alabama. His work on Alabama and the modern South has won him research and writing awards from the Gulf South Historical Association, Alabama Historical Association, and the Lillian Smith Center. And it is fitting that he is our first gallery talk in Justice Not Favor, as he was the lead researcher, writer, and coordinator of the exhibit. Scotty, welcome.
Alex, thanks very much. It's a very kind introduction. And I'd like to just take a moment to begin with to welcome all of you here today to the Changing Gallery. Today, as you may know, is National Voter Registration Day. And so we thought, what better way to mark that commemoration than here in the gallery where we celebrate the story of suffrage in Alabama. Before we go any further, I want you to know that if you are not a registered voter, if you have moved if you've moved since the last election, or if you have any questions about your voter registration status, you can go to the two sites here, alabamavotes.gov, or go to nationalvoterregistrationday.org. Those are the two sites that you can go and to verify your registration or to become registered yourself. Very important to start with that information. So as Alex said, I'm here in the Changing Gallery where we have on view for quite a long time now, Justice Not Favor, Alabama Women in the Vote. This is an exhibit that the Archives has worked on for over 2 years. It was an exhibit that was delayed by the pandemic. We are excited to bring it to you. We want you to come see this exhibit in person when you're comfortable doing so. And for that reason, this exhibit is going to be on view until May 31st of 2022. So a full 9 months where we'll have this exhibit here. So as we start to think about voter registration and Voter Registration Day, there are several pieces in the exhibit that are highlighting that. And that's what we want to start with today by beginning to talk about this end of the session of August of 2020, after the 19th Amendment is ratified and added to the Constitution. We have a situation where we have moved now from a period of working for the vote, of advocating for the vote, to it being something that is secured. And there's a wonderful political cartoon that appeared in a Philadelphia newspaper the day after that happened. So on August 27th, 1920, there's this political cartoon that says "safe." And so what this illustrates to us is the fact that women had moved from fighting for the right to vote to having achieved it, and then to make good on those promises, to transition to full participatory government. And so throughout the nation, one of the ways that happens is with the creation of the League of Women Voters. So the League of Women Voters is created during the annual meeting, 1920 annual meeting, of the National Association for Women, the National American Woman Suffrage Association, excuse me. In Alabama, that became the successor organization to the Alabama Equal Suffrage Association, which is a group that was started by Patty Jacobs. And if you look on your screen here, you can see Jacobs was a member of the National Board of Directors for the League of Women Voters. And so we thought that this case in particular is the first one where we look beyond the questions of shall women vote. Women now have that opportunity. And so the question now becomes how they will register. The questions become more of a practical nature. And so in Alabama and in many states, the timing of ratification is important because in Alabama, the voter registration deadline for the upcoming November 1920 election has actually passed. And so Alabama, unless they call themselves into a special session to cover some of these questions about the practical nature of women voting, Alabama women will be unable to vote in the upcoming November elections. And so there are several states that don't act. There are several southern states that wait a full year before their female voters are able to exercise that new franchise. But in Alabama, Governor Thomas Kilby acts quickly at the urging of suffragists, including Patty Ruffner Jacobs, and he calls a special session of the legislature that convenes in late September of 1920 to address these practical questions of how women are going to be added to Alabama's voting rolls. This is not a simple question. This is a question that involves a great deal of maneuvering on the part of both mechanics, as far as how women will be informed that they're allowed to register, how that process will go. But also there's an economic question, of course, because Alabama since 1901 had a poll tax assessed to its new voters. And that poll tax was cumulative, meaning that it was applied for every year. And if a 31-year-old person came to vote in Alabama, then they had to pay a cumulative poll tax of $1.50 for every year since they turned voting age. And in 1920, that voting age was 21. And so there are questions about whether that's going to apply retroactively so that a 35-year-old suffragist like Patty Ruffner Jacobs or a 31-year-old suffragist like Wiregrass's Scotty McKenzie Frazier in 1920, what will they owe? What will that do to the question of women voting? So there are questions around mechanics and there are questions around economics and politics, all swirling around these questions when the legislature convenes in late September. They make fairly quick work of this. They adopt what I would characterize as a compromise bill. They exempt women from the payment of poll tax until February of 1921. So they give basically a 6-month grace period that allows women not to have to pay the poll tax. And so starting with the spring elections of 1921, they would have had to pay $1.50 per year to vote. The cumulative portion is excluded. The other thing the legislature does is passes a bill that reopens and extends an invitation for Alabamians to register to vote all the way through October 26th. So just a few days before the November general elections. And so during that time period, all throughout Alabama, thousands and thousands of women register to vote. We have a wonderful photograph in the exhibit from Mobile showing women registering to vote in Mobile during this registration period. There were 124,000 women who registered to vote in Alabama in this very brief period. And this case where we are standing now, this case that we call Citizen, this case talks about some of the stories that are in that brief registration period. And so I want to highlight just a few of those very briefly. The first I want to point out is a voter registration certificate from Jefferson County, and this is from a woman named Ann Foreman Ames. So Ann Ames is a housewife from Kentucky. She's 31 years old. She's lived in Jefferson County for quite some time. Ames is one of 23,000 women from Jefferson County who register to vote during this period. 23,000, that's almost 20% of the entire total of women who registered come from Jefferson County. Of course, Patty Ruffner Jacobs lives in Birmingham. She's one of the leaders in the state suffrage movement. After suffrage is attained, there's a big parade in Jefferson County. There's something like 50,000 people in attendance. So it's really no surprise that Jefferson County has an outsized number of women who register to vote. But what's interesting also about this piece is that Patty Jacobs is one of the women who serves as a witness for Ann Foreman Arms for her voter registration. So this is something that, according to the state law, is required. You have to have 2 witnesses to verify your residency and all the other information that you list on your voter registration certificate. This is based on the 1901 Constitution. And so it's not common during this brief time for suffrage leaders throughout Alabama to serve as those witnesses. And so this is a very interesting document that we have on loan from our friends at the Birmingham Public Library Archives that not only shows a woman registering to vote for the first time, but connects that physical act of going to register with a suffragist like Patty Ruffner Jacobs. So quite interesting. Another element in the case that we want to talk about is this really fine book that we have here. And I'm going to move out just enough so we can see. The book that you see here in the case is from Houston County, down in the Wiregrass. And so when when new voters are added, when women become new voters, there's also there's new records that are created, right? It's a probate record. And so the book that you see here lists the women who registered to vote in Houston County from 1920 until 1940. This piece is on loan to us from the Houston County Probate Court. And one of the women who's featured in this book and featured prominently is Wiregrass suffragist, author, newspaper editor, Scotty McKenzie Frazier. So you can see at the top of that ledger page there, you can see Scotty McKenzie Frazier's name and see that she was registered in 1920 and that she voted every year thereafter during the decade of 1920 into 1930 that's covered here on this page. So here's a physical reminder of a suffragist who campaigned both with her body and with her words for the right to vote. Then once that right is extended to them through the federal amendment, goes and registers to vote and makes good on that promise. It was a powerful representation there just to see her name. And of course none of us were surprised that Scotty McKenzie Frazier registered to vote and voted every time she had the opportunity. I want to turn now to a piece in the middle, and you see a image here we'll put up on the screen. This is another story that's similar. This is from Madison County. During that same registration period of Madison County, in Madison County, there were about 1,400 women who registered to vote. Of those 1,400 women, only 6 were African American. And the woman that you see here on your screen is Dora Thackler Lowry. She is a school teacher up in Madison County, and she's also the mother of civil rights activist Joseph Lowry, who you may know, who passed away just a few years ago. And so of the 1,400 women who registered to vote in Madison County during this registration period, only 6 were African American. So that brings us to an important point. The same restrictions on voting that applied to men, regardless of their race, based on the 1901 Constitution, after 1920 also apply to women, regardless of their race. So there is a poll tax. We talked about that. There is a literacy question. There are questions about residency, right? And there's also, you have to have a certain amount of real property to be allowed to vote. It's, I believe, $300. This is real money. And these are just some of the ways that Black men and women after 1920 are kept from voting in Alabama until after World War II. And so to see the image here of Dora Lowry and to think about the names of these 6 women is important, because when we look at their story, we see that they had a certain level of economic security and they were able to meet the requirements and register to vote. I'll stop here and tell you that in late October, on October 24th, there will be a historical marker dedicated in Huntsville to honoring the lives of Dora Lowry and the other 5 women who registered to vote that day. So our friends at the Historic Huntsville Foundation were good enough to help us include these stories in the case, and we're excited to participate in dedicating that important historical marker of the Alabama Historical Association's program in just a few weeks. But the story of Miss Lowry, the story of those other 5 women, is actually the exception, not the rule. Registrars in Alabama had wide discretionary power, especially before the mid-20th century, and the majority of Black men and women who went to the registrar's office or went to the courthouse to become a registered voter were denied that right. And so it was important for us to include a story reflecting that as well. And so we have this image and a headline here of the story of Indiana Little, who in 1926 was refused the ability to register to vote at Jefferson County Courthouse and led a protest. She feels like that under the 15th and 19th Amendment and under the tenets of the Constitution that she should be allowed to vote, and she is excluded from that right, she believes, because of her race, and she leads a protest and is arrested and thrown from the courthouse steps. She starts something there that resonates. And so when historians were talking to Birmingham people that were involved in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, and they talked about sort of the roots of their activism and what sort of things led them to want to fight for their right to vote and engage in nonviolent protest. Many of them referred to Indiana Little, who at that point was an older woman, and remember the stories from their parents or their grandparents about Indiana Little's protest at the registrar's office in 1926. And so an interesting parallel, I think, to what we see later on. And as we were conceiving this exhibit, that was one of the things that really stuck with us, was that if we told this complex story of suffrage in Alabama, that we couldn't just stop in 1920. We couldn't stop with ratification of the 19th Amendment, because that is only part of the story. As you can see from Indiana Little's portion here, that is only half of the story. And one of the ways that we wanted to connect to a broader, more complex suffrage story was to look beyond the fight to ratify the 19th Amendment and to look at the efforts to secure those rights. And Amelia Boynton Robinson, the Selma voting rights activist, who's so well known for the Dallas County Voters League, but also for her work years before, she really helps us here because her language is so important. And she says in a quote that we have included in the exhibit, she says that the rights that we were promised under the U.S. Constitution meant little unless we could claim those rights. So some of the rights that she's talking about here are, of course, the 19th Amendment. That's one of the rights that she's referring to, and one of many. And so it was important for us to think about this exhibit as having a longer view. And so that's what we tried to do here by extending to look at the voting rights fight after World War II and questions that have happened in Alabama around equal representation and Alabama women since then. The language here is what drew us to this point, because the way that Amelia Robinson frames these questions is similar to the way that Patty Ruffner Jacobs framed her debates before the legislature in the early 1900s. It's the same way that Frances Griffin in 1901, who's the first woman to address an Alabama lawmaking body, when she goes before the delegates of the state constitutional convention and asks them to extend to women the right to vote, the language is the same, the themes are the same: justice, fairness, equality. We see that in 1901, we see it in 1920, and we see it with women like Amelia Boynton Robinson in the 1960s and beyond. And so the case that we have here profiles some of that story. And so what we see in the top here is an interesting story about a woman named Betty Anderson. Now, Betty Anderson is not a household name. Betty Anderson doesn't have the name recognition that, of course, Miss Robinson does, or even Patty Ruffner Jacobs. But Betty Anderson's story, I think, helps us in such a profound way with this exhibit because it encapsulates these two questions. Betty Anderson was a resident of Camden in Wilcox County. She was 15 years old in 1965. She was a participant along with her older brother in Bloody Sunday, and then she was also a participant in the Selma to Montgomery March, along with her brother, and they packed very little and went along the march. And so on the third day of the march from Selma to Montgomery, on the third day, you may know that it rained. And of course, if you live in Alabama and you've experienced rain in March, you know that sometimes it can be a rather long and soaking and driving rainy experience. And that's what they had. They had rain on them for most of the day on Tuesday. And by the time they got to the campsite that night, Betty Anderson realized that she had worn a hole in the sole of her tennis shoe. Betty did not have another pair of shoes on the trip. As I said, she packed light. And so there's a real question here amongst her and her brother as to whether or not they are going to continue. Well, another participant who they did not know saw what was happening and walked over and offered some advice. They said that if they could patch the shoe, then she would be able to continue. So what they end up deciding to patch the shoe with, this woman tells them about Cracker Jacks. We know Cracker Jacks, but Betty, as a 15-year-old girl in rural Alabama, had never heard of Cracker Jacks before. Well, the Cracker Jacks aren't important, but the box is, because it's wax sealed, right? So it can keep it fresh and keep it from getting stuck to the packaging. So this woman takes a box of Cracker Jacks, takes the box and fashions it into a patch for Betty's shoe, puts it in the sole of her shoe, and Betty and her brother, along with thousands of others, complete the march all the way to the Capitol in Montgomery. When they go back to Camden, Betty keeps the shoe, which is incredible, and we're so thankful that she did. But you also see the piece behind me, the apron. This is an apron that her father, John Anderson, fashioned out of the clothing that the pants especially, that she and her brother John wore on the March on Washington. So Betty the shoe. She has all these interesting things as well. Betty runs a museum in Camden called the Shoe Shop Museum. That's an homage not only to her father, who was an important and independent African-American businessman in the Black Belt, but also an homage to the people around Camden in the Black Belt that participated in the Voting Rights March. And Betty, as you see here, is well, and Betty is an active participant with the archives, especially our Alabama History Institutes, which are sponsored to help Alabama school teachers integrate more history into their curriculum. So we're so thankful for having these pieces here. But Betty Anderson was 15 years old, as I said, when the Voting Rights March took place. She's 15 years old when the landmark Voting Rights Act is signed into law. So she is several years away from being able to, as Ms. Robinson said in that quote, claim those rights that she had helped to secure with her participation in Selma. But her mother and her father were not. And so the next piece we want to talk about is Mary Anderson's voter registration certificate. So this is Betty's mother, Mary Anderson, who was born in 1922. And you see the date there on her certificate. It's signed in November of 1965. So I want to take just a moment, since this is National Voter Registration Day, I want to take just a moment and tell you a little bit about how we can interpret a lot about the poll tax and a lot about Alabama and federal politics and the end of this question of claiming our rights from this one small document. So Betty Anderson's mother, Marie, this is November of 1965 when she goes to the Wilcox County Courthouse and pays her poll tax. The poll tax was $3. She's paying for 2 years worth of elections. Those elections were local and state elections only. They were not at that point required to pay for federal elections, and that was because of something called the 24th Amendment. And so the 24th Amendment had outlawed the practice of states applying the poll tax to federal elections. And so the tax that that Marie Anderson pays in November of 1965 is for Wilcox County and Alabama elections only. And that practice by 1964 was limited to just 5 states. There were only 5 states, all of them southern states, that were at that point still applying the poll tax. Lyndon Johnson, in the legislation that was passed through Congress for the Voting Rights Act, helps to bring that practice to an end. Now, so there's a bit of a misunderstanding, a misconception maybe, that the poll tax was outlawed by the Voting Rights Act. It actually wasn't. What was in the Voting Rights Act relative to the poll tax was something very specific. There's a section that directs the Attorney General of the United States to join a lawsuit or to bring suit on behalf of the government against the states that still have the poll tax in federal court. And so that's what the Attorney General does. There's actually, there are 2 cases in Virginia that are already working their way through the state and district courts. And so the Attorney General of the United States joins in that action, and that case is fast-tracked and makes it to the Supreme Court in March of 1966. So just about 4 months after Marie Anderson would have signed that poll tax receipt and paid her $3. The Supreme Court in 1966, in March of 1966, invalidates the poll tax. They say that it is a measure of wealth. They say that charging a fee payment for any sort of measure of someone's wealth, like their race, like their creed, like their sex, should not enter into consideration in their ability to participate in the electoral process. And so just about 30 years after the Supreme Court in 1937 had allowed states to keep the poll tax, another court in 1966 wipes it away. And it does it based on a reading of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And so the poll tax receipt that we have in the exhibit here from Marie Anderson, just like her daughter's shoe, is a very simple thing, but I think a very profound artifact that tells us a lot about hard-won rights to vote and about really in-depth and nuanced issues related to voting in Alabama. The poll tax receipt of Marie Anderson shows us the last time, it represents the last time an Alabamian had to pay for the privilege of voting. And that's why we wanted to include it here. So as we close, I want to show a quote here on the screen that's also in the exhibit. This is a quote from Carrie Chapman Catt, who is one of Susan B. Anthony's lieutenants in the civil rights movement. You may know, it says, "The vote is a power, a weapon of defense and offense, a prayer. Use it intelligently, conscientiously, prayerfully. Progress is calling you to make no pause." So we thought, what a wonderful way to both end the exhibit, but also to have people thinking as they left the room about the cost, the human cost that it took over generations of Alabamians fighting for that right to vote in a complex situation here in the state, and also have us think as we leave the room about the part that all of us can play in history. So I want to remind you once again that it is National Voter Registration Day, and that if you have questions about your registration status, or if you decided to put on your chin strap and be a part of participatory democracy, you can do that by going to these two websites, alabamavotes.gov and nationalvoterregistrationday.org. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Scotty. That was wonderful to go through and see how they're all connected together, right? Because it's not just one movement. This is kind of long story of suffrage. But I found myself, very interested when you were, oh, and I should also point out, if you have a question, please submit it to our comments, because this is a time for a live Q&A. So before I get started with my questions, I should also say we are interested in your questions. So please comment with them. But Scotty, sorry, what I was thinking about was just all these kind of impediments, these stipulations that are placed on Alabama women. And you mentioned them, but I was hoping you might be able to expand on what some of those stipulations were, like the registrars preventing Indiana Little from registering. What were those stipulations that suppressed Alabama women's right to vote?
Sure, thanks. That's a good question. And I want to couch that question in by looking back to that Houston County voter registration book, that large book. I think that's a good way to think about it and to visualize the question. We tend to think sometimes of these acts of restrictions on voting as something that's modern, that's a response to changes in politics and society after the Brown decision, but it's not. The stipulations that were in place when Marie Anderson tried to vote in Wilcox County, if she had tried to register and vote in Wilcox County before 1965, were placed there by the 1901 Constitution. And those included not only the poll tax, which was cumulative, and I should say it was cumulative until 1953. Then the state removed that requirement, and it was only applied for two years. So it would only apply for $3 worth, regardless of how old you were when you registered to vote. There's a residency requirement that's not terribly lengthy, but it's about a year for state elections, and sometimes longer for local elections. But the two things that really mattered as far as the restrictive nature were the poll tax, whether it was cumulative or not, and the requirement that you have $300 real property. And so that's something that really affects
Oh, Scotty, it looks like you have frozen. There we go.
So that's something, right? Sorry, this is new technology, so thank you for your patience. That's something that has real effects on women voting and on men voting as well. I'll give you just a quick example. The Houston County voter registration book looks really big and impressive, and it is, but a lot of those pages only have one or two entries on them. And I'll tell you that there are 3 different lines of my family who are from Houston County. And being able to study this book and look at them, none of the women from my family from 1920 to 1940 are listed in that ledger. And that's because the poll tax and because of that property requirement is really keeps them from voting. We know that Scotty McKenzie Frazier, of course, was fairly well off, and so that poll tax and the property requirement was not something that would have prohibited her from voting like it would other women in the wire and grass, whether they be white or black. But then, of course, for African American voters in Alabama, women or men, there's a real there's an extra layer of complexity because the registrars have such a wide discretion in who can be allowed to vote.
Sorry, I was muted.
Right.
So we have a wonderful follow-up question from Sarah Walker Carmack. Did women, black and white, in each county need a man to vouch for them when they presented themselves before the Board of Registrars? So did one of those witnesses need to be a man?
That I don't know. I think that it might have been something that at the county level, the registrars might have controlled, but I know that if you go back to Ann Foreman Arnez, to our Jefferson County housewife in 1920, the 2 people that signed her voter registration certificate were both women. So it could have been, registrars had wide discretionary power, and they were, at the county level, there were 3, each appointed by, at one point, the state auditor, the governor, and the agricultural commissioner were the 3 constitutional officers who would appoint each one registrar to every county. And that might have been a county policy, but I don't know that there was a statewide statewide stipulation that one of the witnesses had to be a man. That certainly wasn't the case in Jefferson County with Ann Foreman. That's a good question, Sarah. Thank you.
All right, we have another question from an audience member. So Mary Amelia Taylor, you said that Marie Anderson's poll tax receipt is a representation of the last time Alabamians had to pay poll taxes in order to vote. When was the 24th Amendment, which federally ended the poll tax, ratified in Alabama?
The 24th Amendment, new technology. The 24th Amendment is actually never ratified in Alabama, Mary Amelia. Thank you for that question. Much like the 19th Amendment is never ratified. So the reason is a little different, though. The 24th Amendment is something that is being pushed by Democrats in the northern and western states for quite a while, because most states on their own had outlawed this practice of the poll tax, and there were only a handful of southern states that held on to it. John F. Kennedy, when he becomes president, he tries to use his pulpit to urge the southern states to do away with the practice. And when they do not, congressional Democrats, including in the Senate, led by Hoover and others, they come in and push forth the 24th Amendment to the Constitution. This is late in 1963. And so you need 38 states to ratify it by that point. And so this happens very quickly. Alabama doesn't take it up. One of the reasons they don't take it up is because the Alabama legislature is not in session. The legislature at that point was meeting every 2 years, and they had already closed the session 463 by the time the amendment comes to the states. Now, they could have called a special session like they did to answer questions about the 19th, but they did not. In fact, there is very little material in the papers of the governors, in the material that we have from the legislature that shows at all that they were thinking about taking up the 24th Amendment. And I think that's probably true for most of the southern states. Remember, there are only 6 that this amendment is really targeted at. And so I don't think any of them take up the vote before it's ratified. And it's ratified quickly by February, I think, of 1964. So by the time the Alabama legislature comes back into session in 63 or 65, excuse me, it's already the law of the land. And there's a very simple one-line bill directing registrars not to apply the poll tax to federal elections.
Thank you, Scotty. So you end on this, both the exhibit and your presentation here ended on this really powerful quote from Carrie Chapman Catt. And can you expand a little bit more on the context of this quote and maybe what it tells us for really the legacy of both the suffragists and the activists from the 1920s and the 1960s?
This was, as you know, Alex, this was sort of a late-breaking addition to our plan for the exhibit. We found this quote in a secondary source as we were reading, just to sort of get a little context for the end of the suffrage fight. But it's the date on this quote that I think is important. It's in early September of 1920. And so there's nothing significant about the date unless you back up and realize that just a few weeks earlier, Carrie Chapman Catt, along with dozens of other nationally known suffragists, had descended on the state of Tennessee, who it had turned out was going to be the decisive vote, the 36th state needed. Of course, Hawaii and Alaska are not states yet, so you only need 36 states to ratify. So all these national suffragists and some anti-suffragists, including from Alabama, as you know from your work, Alex, had come to Tennessee, including Carrie Catt, and had lobbied the legislators to support suffrage, and had seen that through, and had seen the 19th Amendment ratified in Tennessee, added to the Constitution at the end of August. And then at the end of that process, Carrie Chapman Catt begins to make her way back to her home in New England. And she gets home that very day in early September, where she sits down and writes this sort of open letter to the American woman. And I think here, she's speaking broadly, and she's thinking, I believe, about the decades-long fight that she had been a participant of. She's thinking about women like Susan B. Anthony, who she worked with so closely, who fought so hard for this right, but who didn't live long enough to see it. And so I feel like there's a lot of emotion tied up into that quote, and especially that last part where she just simply says, "act." And what a better way to end a presentation on National Voter Registration Day than to encourage people to register and participate as well.
Definitely. I think that, we did the research for this exhibit, and as you go through it, all it kind of can teach you about is the power of, one person, one group, kind of one movement to make change and difference, and that the best way to do that is through the right to vote and by exercising that right. It was so important to these women, and an honor to their legacy, like you said, to actually exercise that right now that we have it. We have one final question from the audience, and I would like to end on that one. And it is, how long is this exhibit going to be up? Can you please let us know how long it'll be on view, when people can see it, how they can see it, cost of admission, all of that, Scotty?
Happy to do that. The exhibit will be on view here in the Museum of Alabama, which is on the second floor of the Alabama Department of Archives and History from now until May 31st, 2022. So this is going to be on view for about 9 more months. And so when you feel safe in coming out and coming to the exhibit, it will be here for you. Like everything that we do here at the Department of Archives and History, admission is free. We are your state history museum, we are your state archive, and we want to extend that invitation to you. You can find out more information about our public programming and other digital offerings that we'll be having throughout the year around this exhibit at archives.alabama.gov.
Excellent. Thank you again, Scotty, for a wonderful gallery talk for us and for telling us a little bit more about justice, not favor. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. And please remember to join us again next Monday for Research Rundown here on Facebook and YouTube at noon Central Standard Time. Have a great day.